Before I get to my talk, I'd like to make some preliminary remarks. This is a year of big anniversaries for Israel. It's 170 years since the first Zionist Congress in Basel, 70 years since the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 recommending the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state, 1967, 50 years since the UN Security Council Resolution 242 in November 1967, and of course my topic today, which is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Now, I'm not Jewish. There will be people here today, I know, who know far more about Jewish history and Israeli history than me. I'm also British, and for a Brit to give a presentation on the Balfour Declaration to an audience of Jews or Arabs is walking on potentially dangerous ground. So there may be some here today for whom my presentation may seem to be incomplete, or perhaps misinformed. On the other hand, I hope you will see that I can approach the subject dispassionately, with no preset notions, and this is what I'm going to try to do. And I'm sure you will tell me if you disagree. Now, the Balfour Declaration will be 100 years old on the 2nd of November. Conceived by Prime Minister David Lloyd George's government in London as a gesture that would diplomatically resolve two issues arising from the First World War, it quickly became a document open to different interpretations. To Jews, it was a foundation stone for the establishment 30 years later of Israel as a Jewish state. And to the Palestinians, it was incriminating evidence of British betrayal, of the assurances given to Arabs with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Now, its originators intended neither of these interpretations per se, and yet here we are, 100 years later, and it continues to hang over the situation in the Middle East like a dark cloud. The prominent Jewish intellectual Arthur Koestler would call it one of the most improbable political documents of all time, in which one nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. Why did this declaration happen? How did it come about? Who were the principal actors involved? And in discussion, perhaps, at the end of my talk, we can have an exchange of views on its significance today. Does it really still have importance, or is it actually just irrelevant in modern times? The primary thrust that led to the declaration was Zionism. Theodor Herzl followed his pamphlet, The Jewish State, by organizing the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. And the Zionist goal was the return of Jews to Eretz Israel, or Zion, being the hill of Zion on which the Temple of Jerusalem is situated. But there were many hurdles along the way, not least differences between various groups of Jews on how best to make progress, and the influences of various individuals and personalities. There was also the necessity to win friends in high places in government, without whose decisions and help the goal would never be achieved. And then, as so often in life, there had to be incidents and circumstances when good fortune or simple mother luck enabled pieces of the jigsaw to fall into place. There were, of course, he's a very impressive man, isn't he? With a beard like that. There were, of course, Jewish communities in many countries of Europe, America and elsewhere, each with their own history and background. But I'm going to focus on the efforts of Jews in Britain that led to the Balfour Declaration. Now, one of the pieces of good luck was the interaction between Weizmann and Winston Churchill. They were born only 3 days apart, respectively on the 27th and the 30th of November, 1874. The circumstances of their births, of course, and their subsequent careers were very different. And yet, as you shall see, at various points in their futures, they came together. They first met in all places, in Manchester, England, of course. And some years later, they came together in a way that had a major impact in what became known as the Balfour Declaration. But I leap ahead. Let us look more closely at the life of Chem Weizmann, for of all the characters in this story, it is he, not Sir Arthur, later Lord Balfour, and not Theodor Herzl, who is perhaps the most important. Chem Weizmann was born in Motel, near Pinsk, then in Russia, now in Belarus. His father was a timber dealer, and Chem was the third of 15 children of Oetzer and Rachel Weizmann. His talent for science, especially for chemistry, was recognized in his boyhood years. And at that time, Russian universities admitted only a limited number of Jews for study. And so in 1892, he went to Germany for the chemistry studies at the Polytechnical Institute at Darmstadt. And a short time later, he was transferred to the Royal Technical College in Berlin, where he joined a group of Zionist intellectuals who were deeply impressed by the vision and founder of political Zionism, not the founder of Zionism, the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. In 1897, Weizmann continued his university studies in Freiburg, Switzerland, receiving his doctorate in chemistry in 1899. And in 1901, he took up the post of the professor of biochemistry at the University of Geneva. At the same time, he became more deeply involved in the Zionist movement, and he supported the foundation of the Demokratische Fraktion within the Zionist organization. And then in 1904, he moved to England for the position at the University of Manchester, where he met a young woman by the name of Vera Katzmann. They married in 1906, and in married life, he and his wife then settled in England. 4 years later, in 1910, Chem Weizmann became a naturalized British subject. It was in December 1905 that Weizmann and Churchill met first. Churchill had just been given a government ministerial post, and he had to contest his parliamentary seat in a by-election. So on 10th of December 1905, Churchill was the key speaker at a public meeting in Manchester, which was a protest meeting on the ill treatment of Jews in Russia. And a third of the electorate in that part of Manchester were Jewish. And present on the podium, when Churchill spoke, there was a Jewish chemist and Zionist named Dr. Chem Weizmann. Arising from that chance encounter, and with the January 1906 election only a month away, Churchill sounded out Weizmann to help swing the vote in his favor in Manchester. Weizmann, however, did not wish to become so overtly involved in British politics, and so he demurred. And apparently they met, and in Weizmann's own words, had a, quote, brief introductory and uneventful talk, unquote. Nothing further came of their interaction at this time, but already that initial contact had been made. And it was to bear rich fruit some 10 years later, when Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Royal Navy needed acetone for the manufacture of cordite. But already I'm painting a picture that is too simple. In fact, it was much more complicated and includes persons who had differing agendas and priorities. There were Jews who were against Zionism and who advanced the cause of assimilation. That is, rather than aim for a Jewish state, it was better for Jews to be loyal citizens of the country in which they lived. In other words, Jewish Britons rather than British Jews. And separately, in the second decade of the 20th century, Europe erupted into an unexpected war that brought effects and pressures of its own. Jews fought on both sides, as members of the armies of the countries in which they lived. But for the war, Churchill would not have needed vast quantities of acetone for the Navy. The Ottoman Empire, although sclerotic by this time, would not have collapsed in the way it did, and its Middle Eastern territories have been carved up by Britain and France, with promises made to the Arabs for independence that were to be betrayed by other decisions and for other reasons. And as the war wore on, with mounting casualties in blood and treasure, the British government would perhaps have not felt the need to win the support of America by, among other moves, arousing and currying the views of Jewish Americans. Now in London, there was some anti-Semitism, but not overly so. Over the years, the Zionist movement had made several attempts to gain attention in the higher levels of government. They'd not been rebuffed so much as coolly and courteously treated with that urbane patrician distance often practiced at the time by senior ministers. Requests for an interview were usually given a response that the minister's time was not available, but any written statement submitted will be given serious consideration. There were some Jews in high places, but the one with ministerial power and access was Viscount Herbert Samuel, the first Jew to become a cabinet minister. And until I did the research for this talk, I'd always believed that Benjamin Disraeli was a Jew when he was Prime Minister in 1868. And then apparently I found out he'd converted to Christianity at the age of 12. Viscount Herbert Samuel was a member of the Cousinhood, which was a group of wealthy, assimilated Jews, Jewish Britons, yet beneath an expressionless exterior, he quietly nurtured Zionist beliefs. Before first meeting him, Weizmann doubted whether he would get any help at all, but then discovered that in fact he did have an important ally. Once the war started, Viscount Samuel helped to bring Weizmann into contact with other important British officials. And as a member of the inner sanctum of the British government, Samuel was able to use his position to raise the matter above the future of Palestine. In November 1914, only a week after Turkey entered the war, he had a conversation with Sir Edward Grey, who at that time was the Foreign Secretary. Perhaps, said Viscount Samuel, the opportunity might arise for the fulfillment of the ancient aspirations of the Jewish people. And he advanced the view that, most importantly, a British effort to establish a strong Jewish presence in Palestine would be in British interests, in view of Palestine's proximity to Egypt and the Suez Canal, which at that time Britain controlled. Apparently, even on the same day, Viscount Samuel conveyed the same thought to yet another cabinet colleague, David Lloyd George, who later became Prime Minister, and he immediately recognized the value to Britain of this idea. Now, this was an argument that Weizmann himself would probably not have thought of presenting. But to politically aware persons in high government positions, yes, indeed, it was attractive. To such people, the first and foremost thought is always, is this proposal in our country's national interests? Thus, in November 1914, the seed of promoting a Jewish presence in Palestine was planted in fertile government ground in London, primarily for British national interests. As Weizmann's efforts expanded, in addition to his persuasive abilities and attributes as a speaker, he also began to develop the qualities of leadership and political acumen that took him eventually to the position of the first president of Israel as a nation state. And among other contacts, he established a link with the important and vastly wealthy Rothschild banking family, which in turn gave him added weight in his dealings with members of the British cabinet. Through 1915, Viscount Herbert Samuel continued to press his cabinet colleagues, step by step, to an understanding of the Zionist cause, making progress when he could, and then stepping back when he found against resistance. For example, he found that terms such as a Jewish homeland in Palestine would find favor, whereas the inclusion of a term of higher standing, such as a Jewish state, would not. As the war intensified in 1915, the paths of Weizmann and Churchill crossed again. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Navy was facing a severe shortage of acetone, the solvent which is used in making cordite. And it was known that acetone could be produced from processing maize. And the head of the Admiralty's powder department, a Jewish chemical engineer named Sir Frederick Nathan, suggested perhaps that Churchill should approach Weizmann at Manchester University. And having already met him, Churchill agreed, and so Nathan set up a meeting. And the following is from a piece entitled Finest Hour, written by Fred Gluckstein. Quote, "In his memoirs, Weizmann remembered their meeting. Mr. Churchill was then a much younger man, was brisk, was fascinating, charming, energetic. And among almost his first words were, 'Well, Dr. Weizmann, we need 30,000 tons of acetone. Can you make it?' And I was so terrified by this lordly request that I almost turned tail," unquote. That's Weizmann in his own memoirs. But he did answer. He said to Churchill, "So far I've succeeded in making a few hundred cubic centimeters of acetone at a time by the fermentation process. I do my work in a laboratory. I'm not a technician. I'm only a research chemist." And Weizmann continued, "But if I was somehow able to produce a ton of acetone, I would be able to multiply that by any factor you choose. Once the bacteriology of the process is established, it is only a question of brewing. I must get hold of brewing engineers from one of the big distilleries, and we'll set about the preliminary task." And finally, Weizmann told Churchill, quote, "I shall naturally need the support of the government to obtain the people, the equipment, the emplacements, and the rest of it. I can't myself even determine what exactly would be required." Churchill saw to it that Weizmann was given the resources he needed. And in May 1915, after Weizmann had demonstrated to Churchill and the Admiralty that he could indeed convert 100 tons of grain to 12 tons of acetone, factories were built, and together they produced large quantities of acetone, enough to feed the Navy's ravenous demand for cordite. Thus it was that by 1916, Weizmann was known to senior members of the British government. He'd provided valuable assistance to the country's war effort. And in addition, as an active supporter of the Zionist movement, he was a person of much interest to members of the government who had sympathies for the Jewish cause. Now in December 1916, David Lloyd George became Prime Minister, replacing Herbert Asquith. And in his memoirs, David Lloyd George recalled a conversation he had with Chaim Weizmann before Lloyd George became Prime Minister. Quote, "I said to him, 'You have rendered great service to the state, and I should like to ask the Prime Minister to recommend you to His Majesty for some honor.' And he, Weizmann, said, 'Well, there is nothing I want for myself, but I would like you to do something for my people.' And he then explained his aspirations as to the repatriation of the Jews to the sacred land that they had made famous. And that was the fount and origin of the famous declaration about the national home for Jews in Palestine," unquote. That's all from Lloyd George's memoirs. And Lloyd George's memoirs continued like this. And I've highlighted the particular paragraph that you can read along as I read it out. "As soon as I became Prime Minister, I talked the whole matter over with Mr. Balfour, who was then Foreign Secretary. We were anxious at that time to enlist Jewish support in neutral countries, notably America. Dr. Weizmann was brought into direct contact with the Foreign Secretary. This was the beginning of an association, the outcome of which, after a long examination, was the famous Balfour Declaration, which became the charter of the Zionist movement." In 1915 and 16, however, the British government also had many other irons in the fire. In the actions to defeat the Turkish army, T.E. Lawrence, that's Lawrence of Arabia, was conducting guerrilla warfare with Arab bands, blowing up the Turkish rail connections, and leading surprise raids. Spurring Arab tribes to rise in revolt against their Ottoman overlords, assurances were being given that victory would lead to Arab independence. With the prospect of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman rule in the Middle East, and without telling the Arabs, the British and French were at the same time slicing and dicing the region with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And those of you in the audience who attended my talk last year on the Sykes-Picot Agreement may recall the following, and I'll just give you a quick summary. At about the same time in 1915 and 16 as Sykes and Picot were in communication and drawing lines on the map, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, was exchanging letters with the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi. Now, the Hashemite family traced their descent from the Prophet Muhammad, and they were governors or sharifs of Mecca for hundreds of years. Seeing the end of the Ottoman Empire in sight, Arab nationalists wanted independence. In exchange for Arab help in fighting the Turks, in his letters, McMahon agreed to recognize Arab independence after World War I, quote, in the limits proposed by the Sharif of Mecca, unquote, excluding areas in which France had interests. And as it turned out, the ambiguous phrasing in McMahon's letters meant different things to different people. The Sharif of Mecca believed that McMahon had now pledged independence of Arabia, including Palestine. From the outset, this commitment contradicted the emerging Sykes-Picot document, and later it was further contradicted by the 1917 Balfour Declaration, so you can begin to see how complicated all this thing was. Several years later, after his retirement, McMahon wrote a letter to the press in an effort to clarify the undertaking that he had given in his letter to the Sharif of Mecca. But by then, in the eyes of the Arabs, the damage was done. Thus, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that in London there were three matters in hand that were mutually contradictory. In the field, the Sharif of Mecca and his son Emir Faisal were being given military assistance to overcome the Ottoman army, in the belief that success would bring Arab independence from Damascus in the north to Aden in the south, Aden in what is now Yemen, in southern Arabia. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, meanwhile, being done in secret between the British and the French, was dividing up the area for post-war British and French control. And in London, Viscount Samuel and the Zionist movement, led by Chaim Weizmann, were doggedly massaging language regarding Palestine that would lead to the declaration. So among the questions that linger today, 100 years later, is, were the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers in London fully aware that they were proceeding along contradictory paths? Or was it a case of the right hand simply not knowing what the left hand was doing? The Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France was set out in a letter from the British Foreign Secretary to the French ambassador in London on the 16th of May 1916. Yet the months of spring 1916, those very same months, were precisely the months when Herbert Samuel was trying out various phrases of language with the aim of winning government approval regarding Palestine. And perhaps the thinking was that these positions were perhaps complementary rather than contradictory. In London, Viscount Samuel was also having to overcome opposition from another quarter, namely the assimilated Jews. And this view was led by Samuel's own cousin, Edwin Montagu, who argued that control of Palestine was of little value to Britain, and nor would Jews find satisfaction. Quote, "I cannot see any Jews I know tending olive trees or herding sheep," he said. "Jews would be better off to stay where they were and assimilate. Moreover, if Jews were to be given a homeland in Palestine, they would become unwelcome everywhere else in the world." Montagu's objections were generally in line with the views of the Prime Minister at that time, Asquith, that was before David Lloyd George took over, and also gave Asquith a useful political benefit in demonstrating that the opinions of the British Jewish community were in fact split. The year 1916 rolled on, with horrendous deaths and casualties in the trenches of war in Europe, and armies of both sides grinding to a halt in the mud of Flanders in the west, and on the eastern front as well, where the Russian army had lost almost 1 million men. Uppermost in the summer of 1916, uppermost in the minds of the political leadership in London, was the progress of the war, or should I say the lack of progress of the war, in France and Belgium. The Battle of the Somme began on the 1st of July 1916, and on that single first day the British lost 57,000 casualties. To the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, what was going on in the Middle East was of far lesser importance than what was going on in France and Belgium. Yet the Arab and Jewish nationalist movements at the same time pushed relentlessly forward, each largely oblivious to the other. On land, the Arabs were undisciplined and disorganized, but slowly making military progress by guerrilla warfare against the Ottoman army, while in London, the Zionists were fighting a battle of words and persuasion. But while Weizmann and his Zionist colleagues were single-mindedly pursuing their goal, as I say, there were many other issues preoccupying the attention of the great and the good in government in London. By January 1917, the war in Europe was largely at a stalemate. Britain was losing hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping to U-boat attacks in the Eastern Atlantic, and at the beginning of February 1917, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare in the whole of the Atlantic Ocean, all the way far west to the American coast. Britain needed a game changer, and this came in the form of the coded Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico, in return for which, upon victory, the lost lands of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas would be returned to Mexican sovereignty. I gave a talk on that in spring. Some of you perhaps came along to that talk. Decoded by British intelligence, when its content was made publicly known, it and the German decision of unrestricted submarine warfare triggered the United States declaration of war against Germany on the 6th of April 1917. And yet, during the months of 1917, Weizmann carefully cultivated his contacts. He made a particular point of engaging the active support of Lord Rothschild, who moved easily, as I've said, among the wealthy and influential circles of London and Paris. And Weizmann also came into closer contact with Sir Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot, who, although Weizmann didn't know, were again still involved in their much deeper game. The existence of the Sykes-Picot Agreement had not been revealed to either the Zionists or the Arabs, and both groups would have been dismayed by its terms. Instead of allowing the establishment of a Kingdom of Arabia from Aleppo in present-day Syria down to Aden in present-day Yemen, as the Sharif of Mecca believed he'd been promised by the McMahon Correspondence of 1915, the Ottoman area was to be divided up between Britain and France. And instead of establishing Palestine as a home for the Jewish nation, it was to be governed by an international condominium, the form of which would be decided at a later date. And even between the British and the French, there were suspicions that the other might somehow cheat and end up with a better deal than each envisaged in the agreement. Thus, the spring and summer of 1917 saw a feverish game of poker by the various players, with each keeping his cards close to his chest. Sykes worked closely with Weizmann and his astute colleague, Nahum Sokolov, while at the same time keeping absolutely quiet about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But Sykes and Picot must have known that if and when the nature of their agreement came to light, they would actually be held to pay. And in the summer of 1917, it did, and there was. Both Amir Faisal, the son of the Sharif Mecca, and Sokolov smelled their own particular rats about what was going on. The Sharif refused to believe the duplicity by the British until Lenin achieved the October Revolution in Russia 1917, and in December 1917 the Bolsheviks publicly revealed the actual text of the Sykes-Picot Agreement that they had found lying in the Tsarist archives. You couldn't invent a story like this, you know. For the Zionists, the recognition that it seemed that the British and French had other plans for Palestine simply served to encourage them to redouble their efforts. Various drafting phrases were tried with the aim of pinning down a text that would find the approval of Prime Minister Lloyd George and his cabinet. And eventually, in July, a short draft was passed to Lord Rothschild, who sent it to Foreign Secretary Balfour with a note. Quote, "At last I am able to send you the formula you asked me for. If His Majesty's government will send me a message on the lines of this formula, If they, and you, approve of it, I will hand it on to the Zionist Federation and also announce it at a meeting called for that very purpose." Then followed 3 months of cabinet indecision. Edwin Montagu presented forcefully his assimilationist views and argued that the use of the phrase, quote, "the home of the Jewish people," unquote, would vitally prejudice the position of every Jew living elsewhere in the world. Unable to agree, it was decided to consult Britain's new ally, President Wilson of the United States. And when Weizmann heard of this, he took action with the American Zionists to urge a pledge of support from President Wilson. And at the same time, Weizmann mobilized Jewish congregations in Britain to flood the Foreign Office with telegrams urging support. In the cabinet, argument waged to and fro. Lord Curzon, who had been to Palestine, argued that it was, quote, "barren and desolate. A less propitious seat for the future Jewish race could not be imagined," unquote, said Lord Curzon. And what about the existing Muslim population? The phrase that Palestine should be the national home of the Jewish people was therefore replaced by a national home for the Jewish people, and a phrase recognizing protection of the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities was added. At the same time, further consultations were conducted with Zionists and with anti-Zionists in the country. And finally, together with all this material, plus a telegraph from President Wilson, who of course by his nature was in favor of reducing imperialist and colonialist power, President Wilson conveyed his unambiguous support of Zionism. And the British cabinet met again on the 31st of October 1917. And they authorized Foreign Secretary Balfour to reply to Lord Rothschild in the following terms. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. On 2nd of November 1917, this response was sent by Foreign Secretary Balfour to Lord Rothschild, and thus it became known as the Balfour Declaration. So the aftermath. What happened after that? Well, as we all know, it's been a tortuous story, and it continues to be so. The defeat of the Turkish armies in October 1918 and the end of World War I in November 1918 left the British in control of large areas of the Middle East. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and the San Remo Conference of 1920 confirmed British authority in Palestine, and this was ratified in 1922 with the formation of the mandate system approved by the new League of Nations. In March 1920, the Arab Kingdom of Syria under King Faisal was declared, but the French were having none of that, and they forced him into exile just 2 months later in July. In 1921 then, the British found a job for him by making him King of Iraq. And in 1922, they carved out of Palestine to the east of the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee a new kingdom, which was called Transjordan, and they placed that under the kingship of Faisal's brother Abdullah. And the present King Abdullah of Jordan is Abdullah's great-grandson. From 1919, the pace of Jewish immigration to Palestine picked up. From some 36,000 in 1912 and less than 5% of the total population, by 1946 the Jewish population was over 600,000 and 31% of the whole. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, Britain continued to maintain administration over Palestine. Viscount Herbert Samuel himself became Britain's first High Commissioner of Palestine from 1920 to 1925, and he tried hard to be impartial. But the knowledge to the Arabs that he was Jewish did nothing to calm the growing concerns of the Arabs as more and more Jews arrived to live. In 1936, a full-blown Arab-Palestinian revolt erupted against the British administration and in favour of independence. Although aimed primarily at the British, inevitably Arab-Jewish friction became accompanied by violence. Jewish reaction was accompanied by actions by the more restrained Haganah, a covert paramilitary force, and then by reprisals by the more aggressive Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, both of which were to play a major part in later events. An investigative commission in 1937 estimated that there might have been as many as 1,000 deaths and recommended that Palestine should be divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with the territory still under British overall administration. But this idea was stillborn, and soon thereafter, just 2 years after 1937, came 1939, and Europe was plunged yet again into another world war. So looking back, one can see that the process that led to the Balfour Declaration and the outcome that followed it resulted in mistrust and resentment on all sides. The Zionists were enraged when they found out about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sheriff of Mecca and his family felt that the outcome of an Arab kingdom promised in the McMahon correspondence had been betrayed by the British government in London. The French distrusted the British as they felt that Palestine was an integral part of Syria. And the British distrusted the French, who seemed to want a part in the administration of an international condominium. Arabs and Jews distrusted each other, and they came to blows and conflict. And even amongst the Jews, there were Zionists and anti-Zionists. And Lawrence of Arabia himself resigned from the British Army in disgust, feeling that decisions in London had failed to deliver on the promises of Arab independence that had been given to the Sheriff of Mecca and his sons. As recently as the summer last year, 2016, the Palestinian leadership requested an apology from the British government for the Balfour Declaration. They received silence. Now, in this book, The Balfour Declaration, The Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, from which I've drawn much of this talk, Jonathan Shear ends with this comment. During World War I, Britain and her allies slew the Ottoman dragon in the Middle East. By their policies, they sowed dragon's teeth. Armed men rose up from the ground. They are rising still. Thank you.